cRPG, ARPG, JRPG, wRPG? What's the difference?
Stick around and you may find out.
Let's start with the OG, the plain RPG,
which stands for role-playing game.
Is a genre of tabletop games in which a group of humans make believe to be other characters, oftentimes fantastical ones, with various traits and abilities who go on adventures and generally resolve skill tests through the use of various multi-face dice.
All the other RPGs we'll be talking about flow from here.
It can be relatively difficult and subjective to boil down the component parts of a tabletop role-playing game, but the overall characteristics tend to be: the player is in charge of one or more characters, the player or players can usually affect the story through their interactions with the game world, the games feature some system of level and ability progression, allowing the players to customize their characters to varying degrees of freedom. Likewise, they feature in general some amount of inventory management and or survival type mechanics. Conflict resolution usually happens through turn-based combat, although not universally. By far the most well-known tabletop RPG is Dungeons & Dragons, which is the progenitor of the entire genre, but there are numerous others that cater to many other types of settings, adventures, as well as different gameplay mechanics.
If you want some other titles to look into in order to diversify your tabletop RPGing, you can start by looking into Pathfinder, Shadowrun, Fantasy Age, GURPS, Vampire the Masquerade, Call of Cthulhu, Mutants and Masterminds, Battlelords of the 23rd Century, and these only scratch the surface once you start looking into everything that's out there.
I seduced the priestess.
Quite soon after the first ever edition of Dungeons & Dragons was released in 1974, we also have what could be considered the first ever cRPG,
or computer role-playing game.
A few small titles written by students on their university's mainframe computers.
For more information on these, as well as some other things that I talk about in this video, I link my sources in the description.
So, computer RPGs,
or cRPGs,
started in 1974, with the more impactful and well-known titles starting to pop up from the beginning of the 1980s. Titles like what would later become the Ultima series and Wizardry in 1981.
So what could be listed as the general characteristics of a cRPG?
Accent is put on you customizing your player character or characters. The player initially couldn't really affect the story, the onus being on surviving the combat challenge of any given dungeon or dungeons.
However, as computing technology improved, the player started being able to affect the story. And nowadays, this is one of the main characteristics of a cRPG.
The games generally feature some system of level and ability progression, allowing the players to customize their characters to varying degrees of freedom. However, this wouldn't be universally true, with some games aiming for a more streamlined approach of auto-leveling stats and skills. Inventory management and survival skills are still featured, but much less crucial than in their tabletop counterparts, since these are much easier to track on a computer. Conflict resolution still generally boils down to hitting things with a variety of weapons and or spells. Visually, cRPGs can be first-person, top-down, third-person isometric, or full 3D, which can be either first-person, third-person, or in some more modern cases, it allows you to switch between the two. The mode of play has traditionally been on a computer, using a keyboard and a mouse, the games themselves being turn-based, especially in combat. However, with the advance of computing technology, a new, more action-centric way of playing these games arose in the form of the action RPG,
or ARPG,
a subgenre of the cRPG.
It also seems from these first few years that we already start seeing a crystallization of two different approaches of making these games.
A top-down iconographic approach and a first-person perspective one. Both of these will then spawn their own cRPG subgenres. First-person dungeon crawlers and what would later on become at first top-down, later isometric, and then third-person or first-person RPGs. And these would themselves branch out further still into roguelikes, immersive sims, multi-user dungeons,
also known as MUDs,
tactical RPGs, and MMORPGs.
And you need to appreciate the supreme self-control I'm showing by not going down each of these rabbit holes in turn. But let me know in the comments if you'd like to know more about them in the future.
What's a paladin?
A Japanese version of wizardry was also released in 1981, and it did so well in the country that it spurred on a bunch of local developers to explore and experiment with the genre. These primordial titles will then further inform and influence the creation and development of what we in the West started calling JRPGs with 1987's Final Fantasy, which would act as the introductory JRPG title to many mainstream gamers in the West at the time.
That being said, Final Fantasy is not the first title that could be considered a JRPG.
Titles like Black Onyx and Dragon Quest preceded and informed Final Fantasy, but Final Fantasy was the one that broke through in the West, and the title that created the need to have a different RPG branch, that of JRPGs.
Much like with the previous genres, I would only attempt to contour some of the main characteristics of JRPGs.
The character or characters the player controls are usually named and part of a linear storyline. While there is a leveling and progression system, this too can range in how it is implemented, offering more or less freedom of customizing your characters. The accent is much more on you going through the linear story as opposed to interacting and affecting its ending. There is usually an overworld and oftentimes grindy random encounters in between major story locations. Combat is turn-based, with the various abilities and consumables being available through a series of drop-down menus. The visuals are anime or manga-esque, generally top-down, but not exclusively. The game is made in Japan.
And for the longest time, they were exclusively console-based. And that last one used to be the clear delineator for the longest period of time. However, that also started to change around the year 2000.
With an increasing number of games that would be described as JRPGs being developed in the West. Likewise, from around that time, several JRPGs started being ported to the PC. So how do we fit those into our definitions?
The answer is simple. We don't.
In the case of JRPG-influenced tribute games made in the West, titles like Septerra Core, Felseal, Arbiter's Mark, or Shadows of Adam.
Personally, I prefer the terms of JRPG-inspired or JRPG-influenced.
Because they are not in fact made in Japan, but ascribe to most, if not all, the other characteristics of JRPGs.
What about PC ports? Does that make a JRPG into a cRPG?
No, it doesn't, because the platform is only one of many other characteristics required to clearly define between the two. Just how you wouldn't call the console version of Divinity Original Sin 2 a JRPG just because it's on console.
Hopefully, the differences between them I outlined will make differentiating between them simpler.
Please, what's with that hairdo? It looks like a cheap wig a would wear.
However, release platform is the crucial defining factor of a more relatively recent moniker of wRPGs,
or Western RPGs,
which most likely came into being as a response to the mainstream takeover of the video game RPG domain by console-based JRPGs. As such, the term wRPG applies both to older cRPGs as well as newer titles that are mainly PC exclusive and that harken back to the older tradition of dungeon crawlers, roguelikes, or isometric cRPGs.
What about the Souls games? They're made in Japan and they have many RPG characteristics. Does that make them JRPGs?
I would argue that their action-oriented combat system focused on developing quick reflexes and memorization, coupled with the mainly environmental storytelling, sets the Souls games apart from the general definition of the JRPG and has allowed them to create their own subgenre of Souls-like games. Starting with the 2010s, there has been a lot of experimenting and fusing when it comes to video game genres, especially in the indie realm. So most games nowadays tend to be mainly one genre, but with influences from secondary ones.
And RPGs tend to be those secondary ones.
The Iron Oath, for instance, is mainly a hex-grid tactics game with heavy RPG influences. Warhammer Battle Sector is likewise a tactics game with RPG influences. Wildermyth is an equal parts blend of narrative storytelling and RPG. So even if you're not playing a full-fledged RPG, you might still be playing different parts of one.
But the main thing I want to drive home is that all of the types of games that I've mentioned up until now classify under the general universal term of RPG. Regardless of platform or the time and place of development or release, we are all role-playing gamers. whether we prefer the tabletop, the computer, or a controller. This shared common interest that connects us is bigger and stronger than the things that set us apart. If you want to see more videos about cRPGs, I'll post a playlist, I think, over here. I've been Steven Hansons, thank you very much for watching. I have a Patreon, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in my next video.